Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Bob Bauer is with us. Bob is a political lawyer. He was White House counsel to President Obama and the personal attorney to Joe Biden. Bob has written a truly fascinating book about our politics entitled The Unraveling: Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis. I read it, and it is a must-read for all interested citizens. Bob played the part of Donald Trump in the Biden debate preparation this year. A veteran of the political wars where retribution, political violence, incivility, and outright misrepresentations have become the order of the day, Bob has written an important book pleading for ethical standards and voter protection in a dangerous political climate for our democracy. We're pleased to welcome Bob Bauer to the program. Well, Bob, good to see you. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much.
Now, The Unraveling, when did it start to unravel? What is being unraveled, and where do we stand now?
It's hard to say what the beginning is. The book is sort of my looking at that issue as it's developed over the course of a career, as I've seen it play out. And the book is not entirely a memoir, but I draw on personal experiences and try to see how, in a career that was devoted to partisan politics, I've seen that line of unethical politics both aggressively approached and sometimes completely passed. And so it seems to me, now that we are worried about democratic institutions, protecting democratic norms, upholding the rule of law, that we have to increasingly understand how critically important it is that those with public and political responsibility in our lives understand ethical responsibility. Not every issue is going to be a legal one. Sometimes it really is fundamentally a question of the right thing to do, and the right thing to do with an eye on the health of the democracy.
Now, you call yourself a political lawyer. What is a political lawyer?
Well, any number of lawyers, of course, could be political lawyers who were involved in politics. In my case, I picked early in my career, a specialty, which was representing clients who were involved in politics and helping them navigate the legal requirements for doing what they wanted to do: run for office, support candidates, engage in advocacy of issues, lobby legislatures for the passage of their preferred policy. And we have a web of regulations and laws, most of them civil, some of them criminal, that those who engage in politics have to be mindful of. And as a lawyer, I counsel them on the best path that they could legally travel to achieve their policy and political objectives.
So are you advising clients as to ethics, or is there a code of ethics that's binding on political lawyers apart from
Interestingly, the government does have ethics codes. The executive branch has an ethics code, and Congress has ethics codes. Both the House and the Senate have ethics codes. And that's mirrored, by the way, in the states, in state government as well. So part of the practice that I had was, and I still practice a little bit on the side, although I'm now sort of full-time in the legal academy at NYU Law. I counsel clients on how to avoid being charged with ethical infractions. For example, elected members of the Congress, members of the House and Senate, can face charges of unethical conduct with significant penalties that can attach to any finding of liability. They can be reprimanded, they can be fined, they can be censured, they can be expelled from the institution. And so there are actually hard ethical requirements that people in public life have to observe. However, there are also fundamental judgments that have to be made, and I wouldn't call them hard judgment, but they're critically ethical judgments. They may not cause them to face liability, but it's incumbent upon them to take those ethical considerations into account when performing the responsibilities of their office. And I give examples of that in the book.
Now, we have loads of codes of professional responsibility. We have those binding on lawyers. We have those binding on judges, federal judges, of course, with the exception of justices of the Supreme Court. And is there a special code of responsibility for political lawyers?
For political lawyers?
Yes.
No, not per se for political lawyers, but they are, of course, bound, as all lawyers are, by the professional rules of responsibility, the canon of ethics. And I've been very interested in particular, and by the way, we've recently seen in the news, some of the issues that particularly confront lawyers in public life. You may have seen recently the New York Times account of the pressures put on White House lawyers by former President Trump to seek paths of sort of retribution against his enemies, utilizing law enforcement processes, the Department of Justice, to visit punishment on people with whom he had political or personal disagreements, including his own personal lawyer, his own former personal lawyer. And those lawyers faced a twofold responsibility: advise the president on what presidents can do to direct prosecutions, and particularly prosecutions that are politically motivated, but secondly, the ethics of it, and their own ethics in the advice that they gave. What was their responsibility as lawyers in facing a demand like that from the President of the United States?
Well, the White House lawyers, and particularly Mr. McGahn, counsel, according to the account, had a memo. They advised Trump that he couldn't prosecute anybody and that he should not engage in political prosecution. He wanted to prosecute Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, others with whom he had political differences or personal differences. And he really succeeded to some degree. There was a Justice Department investigation of John Kerry, and there were others who actually faced serious penalties. So were the lawyers ineffective in providing guardrails for Trump?
In many respects, they were. I mean, Don McGahn is an example. The memos that he wrote, based on the Times reporting, took up two questions with the president at the time, former President Trump. One was, what can you actually do? And the second critical question is, what is it that you should do? Because there may be paths to doing some of what you want to do that you should not do. And why shouldn't you do them? You shouldn't do them because they put tremendous stresses on the constitutional democracy that we have, on the constitutional framework of government that we have. And the lawyers, I thought, based on that account in the New York Times, met their responsibility by not just advising the president on the law, but advising the president on constitutional norms, on how we expect presidents to behave, not just what we permit presidents to do.
So in your book, you were critical not only of a climate of retribution, which now exists in our politics, but there are other problems as well that you refer to in the book. A culture of win at all costs, a feeling that the adversary is the enemy.
Yes.
And a need to bludgeon opponents. Instead of bludgeoning their policies, you bludgeon them personally. And all these things that you want to change. Your book is really a call to action. How do we go about changing all this?
First of all, within a political culture, there has to be sort of accepted standards that we hold our public officials and those who are publicly responsible. We have to hold them to account. We have to say that there are expectations that we have of how they're going to behave that go beyond merely legal expectations. It's a respect for democracies. You mentioned voting protection in your introduction. Respect for the voters. In the quest to win elections, do you trod the voters underfoot? Do you find rules that you try to enforce or that you fabricate that have the effect of depressing the vote or making it harder for eligible voters to participate? Should lawyers be a party to that? I mean, there'll be differences, by the way, about voting policy. But if you set those policies aside, in the drive to win, there have to be limits, or you're putting the democracy itself at risk. And so you're quite right. I thought that a runaway partisanship that just dispenses with all rules of right conduct, that treats the adversary as an enemy, not as an opponent to be defeated, but as an enemy to be destroyed, ultimately puts the democracy at risk. And unless we think about things that way, unless the electorate holds politicians to account for those standards, we're going to see a continued and steady corrosion in our democratic life.
Well, and then also there's the element of racism in our political discourse. I mean, Kamala Harris isn't black. The reference to black jobs, the reference to Haitians eating pets, which is false, and the like. What do we do about that? Is it for the media to correct it with fact-checking, or is it for some ethical commission to come down hard on candidates who engage in this?
To my mind, yes, the media plays a role. Ultimately, the voters play a role. What kind of leaders are they prepared to elect? What kind of leaders setting what kind of moral tone? With what kind of respect for democracy are they prepared to install in high office? But I also think community leadership plays an enormous role. That is to say, the heads of our major businesses, the heads of our religious institutions, the heads of our veterans communities, our law enforcement communities, who ultimately are heard as nonpartisan voices of trust in their communities, who can speak out without being any less a Democrat or any less a Republican, speak out about the sort of conduct and the sort of rhetoric that is in bounds and the kind of conduct and rhetoric that is out of bounds in democratic politics.
Of course, perhaps the most reprehensible is the element of political violence.
Yes.
We saw it on January 6th.
Yeah.
We've had now 2 attempted assassinations on a candidate for president. What can be done about that? Is it for the courts, for law enforcement? How do we deal with it?
Well, certainly, law enforcement, critically important. We have to be sure that we protect the people who enter our public life, and that we have to vigorously prosecute people who resort to political violence. No question law enforcement plays a basic role in enforcing safety. But people who engage in rhetoric in our politics, and I'm not going to speak in partisan terms here, but those who are essentially encouraging violence, subtextually, implicitly, subtly, however they go about it, demagoguery of that order has to be disqualifying. The candidates who do that can't be sort of, if you will, excused as just engaging in politics as usual. They can't be, sort of not taken seriously. If they decide to go down that road, they decide to incite, whether it's pure legal incitement or it's the functional equivalent of incitement, again, that difference between what is legal and what is ethical, they disqualify themselves and they need to be rejected. Whatever voters think of the rest of their policies, that is disqualifying behavior.
Well, what is the line between protected speech and incitement? Take back our country, fight like hell, march down there and tell them something or other. When does it become incitement?
That's very difficult. Of course, there are legal standards, but then there's the question of what we expect from our leaders that may be legal, but goes over the line. We have to fight like hell, to restore our middle class. That's not an incitement to violence, ethical or legal. But we know it. We very frequently can tell that line is being approached. And I think that it is critical for this to be called out by everybody. And frankly, it's most powerful when Democrats call it out on Democrats and Republicans call it out on Republicans. I think it was, and I'm a Democrat, but I'm now speaking in this book in the most nonpartisan of terms, and I call out examples of Democratic, failure in my own, because I think it's important for us to be humble about this and recognize that both sides feeling strongly about their politics may engage in behaviors they later come to regret. But you mentioned January 6th. Donald Trump was not impeached or convicted. Right? He was not convicted. Impeached. He was impeached but not convicted. And because he wasn't convicted, the subsequent vote to at least consider disqualifying him for future office was not taken. How could that have happened? How could it be that as he watched TV and saw it unfolded in the Capitol, he took no action?
3 hours.
For hours. He took no action. Is that incitement? Is that illegal? No, but it was impeachable conduct, and it was a disgrace. Whether it would have been done by a Democrat or a Republican, any president in those circumstances should not have been acceptably engaged in that kind of behavior.
But of course, it's a Hornbook law that where one has a duty to act and fails to act, it's something that
and then the question, correct, and these ethical responsibilities, of course, become all the more significant the higher in the hierarchy of power someone rises. That's the President of the United States watching a violent attack on the Capitol and not taking action. He says today he did. I think the record clearly shows that he did not.
But let me ask you about the debate.
Yes, sir.
You prepared Joe Biden for his disastrous debate with Trump. Did you have any inkling that it would turn out so badly for him?
Let me begin by saying I did the Donald Trump piece of it, if you will, both in 2019 and 2020 and this year. And the role of the person who when you say prepares for the debate, the role of the person who plays the opponent is just to give the candidate that you're preparing the best possible for feeling what he could confront. And I certainly have never thought that Joe Biden couldn't debate Donald Trump. I've never observed at any time that he didn't have what it took to get the critical points across about his policy, his programs, or observed in the course of my association with Joe Biden that he's been anything other than an alert and an effective president. I can't explain how that debate turned out and how people reacted to it, but it is certainly nothing that the whole controversy around the debate and the criticisms of the president are not ones that I would have anticipated or predicted.
Do you think he was correct to withdraw after the debate?
You know, since I've represented the president for a number of years, both politically and personally, I avoid sort of giving my opinion other than to him directly. This much I will say, and I've said this when asked before, he made the decision he made, and this is an example of, I think, presidential leadership because he was the president of the United States, right? He'd won all the primaries, he won them decisively. He won them decisively against a member of his own party in the House who campaigned against him on the age issue. But he made a decision that it was in the interest of the country for him to relinquish the claim that he clearly had on the nomination. He had all the delegates that there were to win. And that, to me, is what we would expect a president to do, to make a judgment like that and to put aside, as he did, his political interests or however he felt about it personally, I thought was very much to his credit, but it was the decision that he made, and I respect the decision that he made.
Are you critical of his endorsing Kamala Harris and not ordering an open convention where other candidates could throw their hat into the ring and possibly be considered?
I'm not critical of it, but I'd have to say again, I have an enormous amount of respect for his political and leadership judgment. That was the call he made, and I have no basis upon which to second guess it.
What do you think went wrong with the debate? You saw it, we saw it, we all saw it. It was sad in a way.
It's a complicated question, I'm sure, for people, particularly ones who read the transcript as well as observed the moments of the debate that they thought went roughly. As you probably know, and as the president has said, he wasn't well before this debate. He'd lost his voice. He proceeded to debate nonetheless, and he thinks that it took a toll on his performance, and I have no reason to doubt his judgment about that.
Are you critical of debate formats, of whether there's an open mic or whether you close off the mic and so that candidates can't immediately answer what the other person says and can't say that's a lie, that's false, and also where there's fact-checking by the media that may be uneven, may favor one candidate or another?
So I also discussed this in the book. Years ago, the University of Pennsylvania sponsored a sort of a bipartisan look at debates. And we thought the time had come to do much of what was done this year for the first time, which is to rid it of its theatrical aspects, not have an audience that's hooting and hollering and cheering and whatever. And so that candidate-to-candidate exchange is just the only bit of business in the room, and I think that was an improvement. On the question of moderators, that will always be controversial. The moderators are reporters, and that's traditionally been the case. They don't have to be reporters, but they have been reporters. And reporters naturally are going to be drawn to reporting the moment, which means if they hear something that's false and they have information to the contrary, they'll provide it. But that's also going to be highly controversial for the reasons that you suggest. Years ago, if you recall, Governor Romney had that moment where Candy Crowley purportedly called him on a misstatement he made in one of his debates with Barack Obama. Much of that happened also this year, and you can imagine Democrats were thrilled and Republicans were not.
In any event, I think the overwhelming opinion from the polls was that Trump lost the debate and
Yes.
with Harris.
Yes.
And Harris won. The Republicans came back and said, well, ABC had their thumb on the scale in the fact checking. But I think it's fair to say Trump lost that debate because of Trump, of the things he said rather than what anyone said about him or what anyone said to him. I mean,
Yeah, look, you can have whatever view you have of the role of the moderators. If you took the moderators out of the analysis, I don't think there's any question that Vice President Harris absolutely outperformed him on any measure you would apply to that debate. The presentation of her policy positions, the coherence with which she expressed them, her nimbleness on her feet. This is how she introduced herself really for the first time to a massive audience as a presidential nominee of the Democratic Party. And I think she did an extraordinary job. That's my view. I also think the performance of Donald Trump, while it bore many of the characteristics of a Trump performance, is not what you would expect from a former president, much less someone who wants to be president again.
How about the criticism of Harris that she's really failed to articulate her policies with any specificity? She's very general in terms of her statements. Peggy Noonan says this is really a contest between the awful and the empty. Do you think she should do more? She was never your client, so you maybe can speak more freely.
Well, I still work on I work on both the partisan and the nonpartisan sides of voting rights issues, so I still help the party with that, just to be very open disclosure here. Look, I'm speaking only for myself here. I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody, but I have to say I find that argument ring somewhat hollow. In a very short period of time, the vice president's responsibility has been to give people a sense of herself as a leader and to give people a sense of the policy direction that she would take the country. And I think she did that. I don't know that anybody wants a 35-page policy paper from her on tax issues or on trade issues, but they want to get a sense from her of how she thinks about those issues. That's what the voters are looking for. And I think she's communicated that, and I think she'll continue to do so over the balance of the campaign.
I think, particularly after reading the book, we can both agree that our politics is seriously flawed and
Yes.
that there is a lack of ethical standards in politics. What do you see as the way forward? You say it's a call to action. What actions would you advocate?
So I do think, this democracy rests not just on what national columnists have to say on the topic, or book writers have to say on the topic, or public elected officials have to say on the topic. It has to be something that is the source of bipartisan support and conversation in communities. And if I could give a quick example, a Republican and I, Ben Ginsberg, who represented Governor Romney in the 2012 presidential campaign, and I represented Barack Obama, he and I co-chair an organization called Pillars of the Community. We go into state and local communities. We focus on battleground states, but we've also been active in Texas. We bring Democrats and Republicans, hardcore Democrats as well as hardcore Republicans who are community leaders, together with election officials in a dialogue that is meant to communicate to the public that whatever their policy or political differences, the communities take democratic life and culture seriously. It's an organized effort, and other organizations are doing so, to say that underneath all of our political differences has to be a bedrock commitment to democracy. I think more of that is needed, and I think in the long run, what I find traveling around the country, Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Texas, I find it's there. You can access that. There is that commitment, and it can be brought out, and I think it will enrich the community's sense that at the end of the day, at least on matters of democratic values and norms, we're still one country.
Do we have to take ethical issues more seriously in order to achieve that?
Yes, we absolutely do. We have to say, I support that candidate, but I cannot live with a decision that candidate made to say X or to do Y. I'm going to evaluate candidates, I'm going to evaluate our elected officials on the basis of how they represent our democracy in action.
Okay, so Bob Bauer, this has been wonderful.
Thank you so much,
and I
Brian.
have a question for you
Sir.
in closing. How do we fix our broken politics?
I'd have to say it's an all systems approach. Whether it begins with civic education, but civic engagement. Here's an example. We encourage, through my Pillars organization, for example, the one that I co-chair with Ben Ginsberg, we encourage people who are worried about elections and who are maybe drawn to election denialist claims to become poll workers. Learn the political process. If you're a Republican, talk to Democrats. If you're a Democrat, talk to Republicans, right? Get involved and do it not just because there's a particular policy you're hoping to advance, because you actually care about living in a country with a vibrant democratic culture. That's the beginning of building from the ground up an ethical framework for our politics that is right now, as you point out, very much eroded.
Build a vibrant democratic culture. That's a wonderful statement to leave us with. Bob Bauer, thank you so much for coming by.
Having me.
And thank you for coming by. I'm Jim Zirin. Tune in next week for more conversations. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app, where you can watch more conversations at your fingertips. Meanwhile, be well, take care, and all the best.